Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Hello, fellow fish lovers, and welcome to Fish University. Now, we all know that fish need clean water and a narrow range of environmental conditions to survive and thrive. But did you know there are cool fish species that make their homes in the desert? Many have developed unique life history strategies that enable them to survive in such harsh and unpredictable water conditions. On today's episode, we're going to tell their story. My guest today is Dr. Scott Bonar. Scott is a professor in the University of Arizona's School of Natural Resources and the Environment and is the unit leader of the Arizona Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. Among his many talents, he is a leading expert in desert fish conservation and management. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really good, Wes. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your listeners, too, joining us today.
Now, an embarrassing story for everyone. Scott is in Mountain Time, and I'm in Central Time. And so when we planned this podcast, I planned it so that I was on at 2 o'clock and he was on at 1 o'clock so we could see each other. And when I got on at 2 o'clock, Scott didn't show up. And then it suddenly dawned on me, Arizona does not follow daylight savings time.
Well, it's crazy here too, Wes. We try to have meetings with folks in different parts of the country, and we're always working to try to keep it straight.
Well, welcome on the show. You're here today. We're going to talk about desert fish. I know you've done a lot of work with a lot of different fish, not just desert fish, but desert fish are really cool. I mean, fish require water. There's not a lot of water in the desert. So for a fish that lives in an area with little water, they've got to be pretty specialized in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit first about where you come from and how you got into fisheries in general and desert fish in particular.
Yeah, so I'm originally from the southern Indiana, the northern Kentucky area. So right down on the Ohio River. So I got into fish, enjoying, the lakes, the ponds, the swamps, the big rivers down there in southern Indiana. I spent my boyhood fishing, snorkeling, just checking things out, exploring. And at the same time, I was also interested in music. I was a clarinet major when I started college. I was going to be a clarinetist and a jazz clarinet and saxophone. Well, I did that for a while. I ended up getting kicked out of the Philharmonic because I missed a solo, and all these people were paying money for that. And so I realized I wasn't good enough to make money at music long term. I said, well, what are my other interests? And this, doing biology, doing something outside was. And I went to the University of Washington for my doctorate when I finished a degree in science education at the University of Evansville in Indiana. And I just fell in love with fish. And so I was up in Washington State for about 18 years, going to school. And then I finished my doctorate and I worked for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we were with the research team there. And we'd work all over the state. We'd work in the mountains, on high mountain fisheries work with bull trout, with the basses and walleye and some of the rivers and things like that. So I got a call one day to come down here to Arizona and interview for a position that I'm in now. And I was thinking, that was crazy. Why would I want to go down that hot, burning desert when I'm up here, where there's all these fish opportunities and stuff? So I thought, well, I'll go give it a try. I'm going to go down there and just check it out and see what it's like. So I came down here and I just fell in love with the place. And it's wonderful for a fisheries biologist. And that sounds crazy. I had all of my friends back there making fun of me to come down here in the desert, about fish. But it really is, like you said, Wes, these fish are amazing, and it's an amazing place. We've got places that you can go out in the desert. And so I'd like you and your listeners to think about terrestrial biology on South Sea islands. Like, for instance, dodo birds or snakes or what have you on, Guam, the Marianas Islands. But similar in the desert, just flipped for fishes. So we have aquatic islands out here in the desert, and you can go for miles and miles and miles on really hot burning areas and stuff like that and get out to an area where there is a spring. And in that spring is its own universe. Those are animals that may have not be anywhere else in the world, maybe in that one area or just in a few areas, down in this spring system. And you can have that way out in the desert. We have beautiful rivers that come down off what we call the Mogollon Rim. It's an elevated area. So we have rivers, like the Grand Canyon. There's fishes there in that. There's rivers like the Verde that come down with the suite of river fishes. And then we go up in the mountains. And we have some of the most southern trouts in the United States, like the Gila trout and the Apache trout that are up in these beautiful mountain country. And you drive up there, Wes, it's like going to Canada. You have Doug fir, Engelmann spruce, all these things up here. So the diversity of fishes in the Southwest is what really struck me, and the diversity of lifestyles they have to be able to hang on, make their living. So that's what really interested me about this place.
The question I had when you were talking about these, what you call biological islands, where you have the islands are water in this case, not land, it raises the question of where do these fish come from? So does that suggest that at one point in time this wasn't a desert, these fish were here, and as the desert formed, the fish became isolated and they became new species?
Yeah, you've gotten that exactly right. What has happened is during the Pleistocene era, you think about the ice ages, all the ice is melting, the water's coming down. There were some giant lakes, and we're thinking about the spring fishes in general. And so a lot of these places were connected by water. Now, let's think about Death Valley. At one time, again, back in the Pleistocene, that had water all over it. And these fishes, like pup fishes, swam around. And then things started to dry out. More and more and more, they dried out. And then the fishes would retreat to little spring systems. And in those spring systems, there's no water out there anymore. There's just these little springs. Then the fish started speciating. They started evolving for that spring system. That's why in some of these spring areas, especially, you get different species from one place to the next. So it's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. And they probably all came from a similar ancestor, and then they've been isolated for so long. How many species do you have out there in the desert?
Well, there are lots. Water, it's, the old saying, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, Mm-hmm. And down here in the desert, that is the case. So we have a lot of competition for the water. And so we've got all these different fish species that are, desert fishes. And I'll just talk about the ones that are listed, threatened and endangered. And I'm talking here in Southern California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. We're dealing with, north of 50 fish species that are recognized on the threatened and endangered species lists. And so you have that going on here in Arizona. We have about 37 native fish species. We've got other ones in all the other states, a variety of them, everywhere from Texas on over to Southern California. So there's quite a bit. And then when you mix non-native fishes into that mix, then you've got quite a few. So you're getting up there at a fair number.
So let's first talk about some of the not so extreme species. Like you mentioned, the rivers. You've got the Colorado River. You've got a few other rivers that run through there, like the Gila River. There's fish in those rivers. They're not necessarily extremophiles or fish that can tolerate extreme conditions. They're your typical river fish, but they're unique because they live in the desert. They're isolated from other species. So I know you've been working with some of them.
Yeah, the Colorado River has the big river species. Things like flannelmouth sucker, razorback sucker, humpback chub, the Colorado pike minnow. Even though that they have that riverine environment like back east, rivers in the east are, pretty flat. And so they have a lot of current, like Mississippi and whatnot, have a lot of velocity. But one of the things we have out here is we have very flashy systems. What I mean by a flashy system, we'll have big, what they call monsoon systems that will come in. These are weather systems. They come in and you're dry, 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 and in the afternoon you'll get a big storm. And what happens in these streams and rivers is you get a big flood, and that flood can happen just like that. And so these fish species that you have, even in the more quote-unquote typical rivers, will be things that can handle these big currents. When you look at the razorback sucker, for instance, it has a sharp keel on the top of it. It holds it in place, so it's able to deal with these big currents that come down. I mean, you look at the Grand Canyon, you go, oh my gosh, look at those rapids they're riding. Well, a fish has to deal with that too. And so you'll see adaptations. You'll see, big bulbs and bumps on the back. I don't know if you and your listeners have seen some of these battleships, and they'll have a big bulb on the front. Well, these fish look like the same. Now, I don't know if battleship designers were looking at these fish and say, hey, we'll move through the really big currents in the water easier if we design it like this, or it just is happenstance. But you have these animals that are designed to get through these really tough environments. You don't need to be able to see very well in some of these environments because the water is so incredibly turbid. And so they'll have small eyes. They'll have very powerful tails, and then they'll have various sorts of shapes on their bodies that allow them to get through that. So even on the ones that you might think are quote-unquote typical, the fish really are a lot different.
Now, that's interesting because I've noticed that with the razorback sucker, the humpback chub, I've always wondered, what was the significance of that large hump behind the head. I never thought about it from a hydrodynamic standpoint. The listeners probably don't realize is that in a river, when you have one of those floods, the current's not the same at the surface as it is at the bottom. There's a zone near the bottom where there's a lot less current, but that fish is kind of tall. So even though its fins and its belly's on the bottom where there's not a lot of current, it's sticking up into the current. So does that sort of press it to the bottom in those high flows or enable it to hold its position better?
People debate what these things do. I'm kind of the school, I go, yeah, those are hydrodynamic characteristics that allow them to hold their place, get behind a rock, navigate in those types of systems. When you get at first the morphology, which is the fish shapes and things like that enable them to be in this river, but you also get their behavior. They hunker down. They're, hanging out. You can get behind a rock and this stuff goes past and you're able to hang on to your place. So I think it's a combination of the two. It's behavior and morphology.
And you mentioned the Colorado pike minnow. Is that the same species that's up in the Northwest? Here there's like a bounty on them?
That's a Columbia River species. This is a different one. No, they're native, both down here and up there. The ones down here, what really amazed me about those things is when you look back in the day, back when their populations were still pretty big, and these things could grow up to 6 feet long.
Wow. And
they're a minnow. They're classified as a minnow. People say minnow, that's just a small fish, but that's actually a family of fishes. And so this minnow species is 6 foot long, and it's the biggest, or at least one of the biggest minnows in North America. This thing is a voracious predator. It was the top of the pecking order in the Grand Canyon. Your listeners are probably familiar with your basses and the striped bass and the largemouth bass, top of the predatory scale out there. Well, out here, the pike minnow was in the Colorado River. So it's quite the animal. But it is different than the one that's up in the Columbia River. They are both pike minnows, but they're different species.
Okay. I wonder why they have a bounty on them up there. They must be interfering with salmon or something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The dams concentrate the salmon, smolts, and things are trying to get out, and they remove them so that source of mortality goes down.
So that's the less extreme species, the big river species where they always have water, but there's a lot of really wild species that exist in some of the smallest and unusual habitats in the world. Probably the most famous one, I think, is the devil's hole pupfish. Let's talk about it a bit.
Okay, the devil's hole pupfish, it's a small blue fish, and it lives way out in the desert. It's 22 millimeters long. And so we've done some work on the devil's hole pupfish on learning how to breed them in captivity, looking at their reproductive behavior. It was the strangest thing to me, Wes, when I first saw these critters. Because imagine you're driving for miles, and this is in the Mojave Desert, driest desert in North America. And you're driving for miles and miles, and you'll see this area where you see some vegetation. And you go in that area, that's called Ash Meadows. And Ash Meadows is a national wildlife refuge and has 23 endemic species. Those are species that are from there and nowhere else in the world. 23 mainly aquatic species, and Ash Meadows has a higher number of these endemic species than any other place for its size. It has a higher number of endemic species than any other place in the United States. So people don't hear about that much. It's really a neat place to go. So you go there and you keep driving and you see this mountain. And you drive to this mountain and you get closer and you see there's a hole in it. Now they got that hole all fenced off. But you get up to that hole, get out of the car, and it's all fenced off, and they have a viewing platform. You can look down, and you see this cavern. It goes right down, and there's the surface of the water. And the fish live there are the devil's hole pupfish. Of course, they've been separated for a long time. There's still arguments between biologists on how long they've been separated from different species. But again, they're about 22 millimeters long. They live in water that's up around 90 some odd degrees. They're dissolved oxygen in there, 2 or 3 parts per million. Most fish need about 5. So these are tough critters. The thing is, if you got water in the desert, people want it, right? So back in the 1960s and 70s, they were trying to turn that land into alfalfa production. And so they started pumping water, and water started going down in Devil's Hole. Now imagine, think about, again, back east, you got places where bluegill and bass spawn, build their nests and everything. Well, the Devil's Hole pupfish had a place it would spawn, and it was this shelf that was close to the surface of this water. And all the rest was a cavern. And so this shelf was incredibly important. It's about 12 feet across, so there's not much of it. In fact, some people say that the Devil's Hole pupfish has the smallest vertebrate distribution of any species in the world because it's just a small area. So this water was going down, and they were pumping the water. And the people who wanted to save the Devil's Hole pupfish were taking this to court, saying this is a unique species. Harry Truman, you don't think of Harry Truman as a touchy-feely sort of guy that's always interested, in just environmental stuff. But he recognized how important this animal was and its habitat, and so he put it in a national monument. And so it went through the courts to stop the pumping, went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the Devil's Hole pupfish was instrumental in some of our endangered species laws. It was instrumental saying you can't do stuff off of a national monument that affects what's going on a national monument. So it was protected, and fish were in there, and they were doing okay. And then their numbers started to go down again, and we don't know what the reason was. Some people think it might be some sort of predatory insect that was put in there. Other people think, well, there may be some environmental changes that's going on. But they were at 500, 400 fish in the hole, somewhere around that. They got down in the early 2000s to 35 animals, 35 individuals in the world that were in that hole. And so that's when we got involved in trying to learn how to propagate the fish, how to breed it in captivity. I had a student in the staff, Olin Feuerbacher, Amber Shadwan. They were some folks who concentrated on the Devil's Hole pupfish, and they learned with another surrogate species that was very close to the Devil's Hole pupfish how to propagate this in captivity. And now they're applying what they know to, there is a desert fish recovery center in Ash Meadows, and they have a replication of Devil's Hole right there. So it's a dug deep, and they have the 12-foot shelf and everything. And so Olin and Jennifer Gumm's also working over there, and they have developed ways to propagate this animal. You know, there's about 200, 300 in the hole now, if I'm not mistaken. It's somewhere around there. And about the same number in the model of the hole in this facility, which is right next to it. So they're doing a good job keeping these things coming back, as are the National Park Service and National Fish and Wildlife, a whole variety of folks over there that are working on this animal to try to keep it around.
You say they have a replicate or a model hole. Is it dug into the aquifer, the same aquifer?
Yep, it's dug right there.
So they've essentially created new permanent habitat for the species. That's pretty cool. I did not know that.
Yeah, it's inside a building. So yes. Imagine you have an aquarium. Say you go to the Knoxville Aquarium or something like that, and they have a huge shark habitat. Well, you have one of those for Devil's Hole in this building, and it looks just like the hole. It's modeled just like it. It doesn't go down as far as Devil's Hole. Devil's Hole is it's a really interesting just geological formation because nobody knows how deep it is. They've gone down to the bottom of it as far as they could, and it wasn't the bottom. It was maybe divers have been down there 300, 400 feet, and there's no end. And the thing kind of jiggles around, so it's hard to take a hydroacoustics depth sounders and figure out how deep this thing is. And so even in the early days, divers have gone down and they've never come back up. They've just been lost. And so we've got this really weird environment. So the Devil's Hole that they built in, of course, there's an end to it. And it goes down, I don't know, 20 feet, maybe something like that. And then there's that shelf up there. But the upper part of the hole, and that's where all the biological activity takes place. That's where they've replicated it.
When I think about something like a habitat for fish, I envision a pond or a lake. Mm-hmm. This is a hole that, maybe the size of a small room?
Yep, exactly right. It's imagine your garage and imagine a hole that just goes down and it has a shelf in it, and that's where all the fish spawn.
And there's a lot more water and cavern below, but the fish don't actually utilize all of that, correct? They're like in the upper layer.
Yes, they're on the upper parts. So you'll find them down deep, but not too deep. They're hanging out in the upper layers because, that's where fish get things to eat and stuff like that.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's W-E-S, .Neal, that's N-E-A-L, at Mississippi State, that's MSSTATE.edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show.
That's not the only pupfish. We're going to talk about several pupfish today, and they just keep getting more and more extreme, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a weird one I'd like to tell your listeners about.
Sure.
Not too many people know about this one. The Devil's Hole pupfish gets all the glory, right? We had a project where we went out and we filmed some of the weird isolated springfish species. There was a weirdo we heard about that we wanted to go check out. It was called the cotton ball marsh pupfish. And to get out there, you've got about a 7 or 8 mile hike over the salt flats of Death Valley. And you got to do it more in the winter because you can't carry enough water if it's summer. The summer temperatures, of course, are getting up to 120 or something like that Fahrenheit. So we hike out to this place. And we look all over the salt flats, and it takes a while to find it. And we finally found this little stream coming out. And what amazed me is this stream is all ringed by salt. The whole thing is just salt. So this pupfish is living in a stream that's about 4 or 5 times the salinity of seawater. And you think about the temperatures we're dealing with, and ones that get up in the summer, this thing's going well over 100 degrees. this is one tough fish. But so you go out there and you see it, and you're just in this complete, desolate, Lawrence of Arabia sort of area that you look as far as you can see, and it's just flats and sand and burning hot hills and stuff like that. And you're out there and you go, this is amazing. And again, that was one of the fishes that was in that lake, common ancestor, and then the lake dried up and they all retreated to their spring heads.
So you're saying that the salinity in this little outflow is 5 times seawater. So we're talking like 150 parts per thousand. What have you measured salinity wise?
Yeah, what is it, 35 parts per thousand on seawater? So take that and multiply it by 4 or 5. We did not measure the salinity when we were out there. We were just out there filming. But, you know, other scientists have measured it, and it is super high.
Is there any other fish on Earth that lives in salinities that high? Because you think about like the Great Salt Lake, the Dead Sea, there's no fish there because of the high salinity, but is it that high?
You know, I'm trying to think. But that's the one that I know of that's as high as I've ever heard of.
Definitely the highest I've heard of too. The next fish I was going to bring up was the desert pupfish. I can only find evidence it goes to about 90 parts per thousand, so that would be way, way above what the desert pupfish can do. Oh yeah, this thing is amazing. And the desert pupfish, in addition to being able to tolerate a little less than 3 times seawater, you can tolerate temperatures of up to 108 degrees Fahrenheit and dissolved oxygen down to 0. The pupfishes are a pretty tough little breed of fishes, group rather of fishes. So what I find sad but interesting is the pupfishes were once all over the state of Arizona. And you'll find them in the wild, like around the Salton Sea, over in California. But they've had an extreme reduction in the habitat that's available to them now. And there's quite a few species, too. I mean, another one that I had on my list was the Death Valley pupfish. And it's even more extreme. I show it ranges in temperature. It can tolerate down to freezing and up to 116 degrees Fahrenheit. 116 degrees Fahrenheit is substantially hotter than any hot tub you've ever been in. I mean, if you think about that, typical hot tubs are what I want to say Jacuzzi recommends 102 degrees for a hot tub. I've been into them up to 104 degrees, and it's pretty hot. So 116 degrees that this poor little fish can survive in, and 4 times seawater, and the habitat that Death Valley is 250, 260 feet below sea level where it's at, something like that. If you get to the lowest point, it's around 200 and some odd feet below sea level, and they have a snail that lives down there in some of the water areas, these little places. But the other pupfishes live in various spring heads around, and they are a tough animal. So tough, as a matter of fact, that people who are studying the human kidney would study the kidneys of these animals because they have to pump water, to keep their bodies running. When they have so much salt content in the water, they have to make sure that they can deal with it. And so the people who, doctors and things, they've studied the pupfish to take a look and see how they're able to do it. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the desert aquatics have had a real big impact on human history. Everything from the ancient Egyptians. I bet most of your listeners don't know that sport fishing and the metal fish hook was started in the deserts of Egypt. Things like the electric catfish, it's in the Nile. But people were finding out the hard way about electricity thousands of years ago. So these animals all over the planet in the deserts they have a unique set of adaptations, and people, since they've lived in these areas close to rivers, we've had a long interaction with these animals. It's interesting what you said about studying the kidney function of these fish, because we've all heard the saying, drink like a fish. And whenever somebody tells me, oh, you drink like a fish, or so-and-so drinks like a fish, I always have to ask, what kind of fish? Yeah. Because a typical freshwater fish doesn't drink. A freshwater fish, it's hyperosmotic to its environment. So it has more salt in its body than its environment than the water has. So water's always trying to come into its body to try to equalize, and salt's always trying to leave its body. So it's constantly getting rid of water. So only saltwater fish drink. And I had never once in my life thought about a desert fish like a pupfish as a saltwater fish, but really they're the most extreme saltwater fish that we have. And it's interesting because they almost certainly came from a freshwater fish. They evolved from freshwater fish. They were freshwater, and over time those systems got more and more concentrated with salt, and they adapted. So our most extreme salt-loving fish came from the freshwater. So it's kind of interesting to think about that, they have to tolerate that salt water despite the fact that they came from an ancestor who couldn't.
Yeah. It's strange, isn't it?
And there's other pupfish. I mean, there's a lot of different species. Comanche Springs pupfish is one beautiful fish. I mean, absolutely gorgeous fish. Pico's pupfish, Potosi pupfish, Owens pupfish. These are a lot of species of these. I don't know how many, do you know how many pupfish species there are?
I was afraid you're going to ask me that, and I can't tell you right off the top of my head. There's a bunch.
I was just curious because to some people, they're all pupfish. Geneticists want to split everything. I hear that all the time. But the reason why they're separate species is because they weren't at one time. They were all probably came from one or a few species. But because of that isolation you mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, I would imagine their genetic diversity within those populations is probably pretty poor. Devil's Hole pupfish, you said numbers got down to 30 individuals.
Yeah, they're very what they call homozygous. Yeah, they're very, very much so. In fact, people looked at these things and they said, how can something this homozygous be able to do okay? Wouldn't we have a problem here? And they seem to be able to handle it. The Devil's Hole pupfish, when you get down to 35, that starts to be a problem.
And until people get involved, it sounds like they live in probably some of the most stable environments, though, right? I would think that these would be very stable places to live until you start pumping the water or doing other activities. Now, there was one thing I don't know, this is coming from the back of my mind. I just remember hearing about this. But doesn't the Devil's Hole spring system in caverns, doesn't it experience like internal waves in the system? How do they deal with that?
Well, my student that I had just got a paper out in the journal is called Copia, and it was on the things that affect the Devil's Hole pupfish reproduction. When do you see the most spawning activity? And so she looked at it and she saw that during these earthquakes, you'd see an increase in spawning activity. And those guys were out there. I think, Amber, there has been some films later from people that were out there, but she got, I believe, one of the first films of this happening. So they were on top, and then all of a sudden the waves started going back and forth in this hole, smashing against the side and coming up and everything like that. And it was a earthquake, I think, down in Chile or something like that, that it's like shaking up a Coke bottle. And they have this big aquifer down there, and it is sensitive to seismic events. And it's something. I think when people go online and they look, if they're interested in seeing this, they can Google Devil's Hole Seshi or Devil's Hole earthquake or something like that, and you'll see just how incredible these things are.
It really is impressive. I've seen videos on YouTube of that, and it's not a little wave. I mean, it comes out of that hole in a hurry because it's all that entire cavern focused on one little garage-sized hole.
Yep, you bet. You bet. It's quite something.
Now, we've been talking about Arizona fishes mostly, and Sonoran Desert fishes. Pupfish is probably the coolest one, but outside the United States, there are some probably even more extreme fish. The one I'm thinking of is one from sub-Saharan Africa, the West African lungfish. Do you know much about it?
I don't. I probably know, a similar amount to what you do, or maybe less. So, we've got desert areas all over the world. Of course, in Africa, Sahara. You got them in Australia. You've got a lot of people down there that like to come up, and they go to our Desert Fish Council meeting. So, yes, these things are all over.
What I know, again, is mostly related to the internet about the West African lungfish, but I looked it up because I remember seeing, I think it was a Discovery Channel video on it at one time. Mm-hmm. And here's this fish, lives in these areas that when it rains, it floods a large expanse. You get these lakes that might be a couple feet deep. And then slowly over time, those lakes start to dry up and you end up with just mud holes. And then this fish has a primitive lung. It can use its swim bladder to breathe. And as the water gets less and less and less, eventually it becomes a mud pit. It can actually undergo something called estivation, which essentially means it can go into hibernation and allow itself to shut down its bodily functions. It makes a cocoon out of its own mucus and burrows into the ground, makes this cocoon, and then it just sits in there and digests itself for energy until the water comes back. Mm-hmm. So it basically will encase itself in its own mucus in a hole in the ground and slowly dissolve muscle tissue with the hopes that the water will return. It's funny because this fish is it goes into such a state of torpor, a state of, it looks like it's completely dead, that people keep them in aquaria. And a number of aquaria owners have supposedly thought they were dead. They basically will shut down, their metabolism gets so low that they're like, oh, it died, and they flush it down the toilet. It was fine. It just has such a low metabolism, it looked dead.
Yeah.
What a crazy fish, right? I mean, to think that we have animals that have learned to adapt to situations like that just amazed me. I do a lot of research in Puerto Rico, and, we'd see these mud flats where tarpon would live. Mm-hmm. And under certain years when, the rains aren't coming and it's really dry, these mud flats would dry up, and you'd walk through this, very dry mud flat, and you'd come up on a hole that might be 3 feet across, 3 feet deep. And if you took a net and you dipped into that water in that hole, which is chocolate milk colored and has zero oxygen in it, there might be a dozen tarpon living in that hole. And you could dip them up and walk them over to the actual water's edge and drop them off, because the tarpon that was their means of survival during this period. Those juvenile tarpon, they would, as the water got really low, they'd swim around in a circle and dig a hole. And then the water got so low that the only water was in the hole. The quality was horrible, but they could breathe the air. They didn't have to use their gills. They could gulp the air and breathe it until water returned. And just fishes, life finds a way. I hate to quote Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
Jeff Goldblum was right. Life finds a way a lot of times.
It does. We've got the same thing. It's not the lungfish out here in our deserts, but we have some fishes. We have a thing called the longfin dace, and we have it living in small creeks. And this animal is a real tough native fish. And what it does is, in these small creeks, they'll have big cottonwoods. It's a type of tree, that lives on the side, huge tree. And so, as you might imagine, photosynthesis, it takes place during the day, and the photosynthesis on these gigantic trees, it's incredible. And so they're pumping out water, making food, doing all this stuff during the day. And so the creek level goes down, and there's like this tiny little mats of algae, maybe some hot pools. This fish is able to live in those things. And then at night, when the plants respire, the creek water, they're not using that water. It goes back in, and you'll actually see the water raise, and then these fish are darting around. So they're able to put up with some pretty tough stuff. And there's another critter. It's called triops, one of your tadpole shrimps. This is the thing where if you order for your kids, you want an aquarium and you want something living in it. It looks like a little triceratops almost, or a horseshoe crab. And you can add water to it, and you can get it going. It's zipping around and doing all this stuff. Well, they have those out here in the desert too. And so you'll get a big rain, say in some of the Utah rock country, some of that areas, and they'll form pools. These aren't like regular lakes or anything like that. It's just like a pool, puddle, I guess would be more accurate. And so these things will come out of there. The eggs will come out, they're dormant, and then they hatch, and boom, you got this whole little area that's full of life. And we were up in St. George, Utah. I guess it was, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And we hiked up into the backcountry, and we saw some of these pools. And it was really a neat sight after a big rain to see these tadpole shrimp all going back and forth, and doing fine. When the desert takes all the water, when it heats up, they go back into dormancy.
Yeah, the triops really are cool looking. They do very much look like a baby horseshoe crab. In fact, I've actually seen on some of the Facebook pages, like I've seen people post pictures of them. Says, "What is this? I found this in fresh water. Is it a horseshoe crab?"
Right. Yeah.
And they're really cool looking animals, and the fact that they do the same thing, that estivation in the soil, and then when the rains return, they come back to life. So I think we've established that there's a lot of really cool fish out there, and they're very tough animals, but they're not without their weaknesses, right? So what are some of the threats that, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the species in Arizona are threatened and endangered. I think I read something like 2/3 of Arizona fish species are on the T&E list. They're either threatened or endangered, or at least in special concern. So what are the threats? What's going on? Why are these fish having so much trouble, besides the fact that it's a harsh place to live?
Well, there's a few reasons. One is we've pumped the water out of a lot of the streams here. So humans have come down and they've used it. The aquifer underwater, groundwater, used to be at about 30, 40 feet under Tucson. Now you want to drop a well 600, 800 feet. So the water is being sucked down a big time. And they call it fossil water because it's not being replaced. It's just, we're in a desert, so it's not going to be replaced. So you've got that. So a lot of streams that once flowed, they don't anymore. A really big thing that affects the fishes out here, our fish communities call it a thing called depauperate. That means that there's not many species. Like we may have 6 species, 5 species of native fishes in a water body. Well, you guys back east, what do you got? 30, 40, 50 fish in a river or a pond. So you got that many species, and of course, the toughest one wins. So you get things like largemouth bass or catfishes, and these things got to be really tough at fighting among other fishes. They have to. That's why the bass, I suppose, is one of the number one sport fishes, is just because it's so aggressive. But when the settlers, the Anglo settlers, came out west, they wanted to fish for the fish that they had back in the east. And so anyway, we got a lot of those non-native fishes, and they were dumped in the rivers. So what happens is these fish can easily beat up, if the conditions are okay in that stream or river for them to live, they can easily eat the other fishes. And so that is a big problem out here, is competition and predation from the non-native species that came from maybe back east or Europe or what have you. And over this whole thing, kind of an umbrella over the whole thing, is we have climate change. And climate change is a big one. Out here, we've seen Lake Mead go to record lows. Of course, that's people using the lake, but it's also evaporating, getting drier. The places that are feeding it, aren't getting as much rain. We've had the largest fires ever recorded here in Arizona since the turn of the 21st century. We've always had fires out here, but now we're getting the biggest, most intense fires as we've ever seen. And so if you have fishes that are up in these fire zones, of course, they're not going to be doing really well. And so our lab has participated with other management agencies. A big fire will roll in, we go in there, you'll get the fish, a bunch of these fish, and you'll bring them back and hold them in the lab. And then when the fire rolls over, there's, some grass that grows up there, then they are reintroduced into that area if need be. So fires are a huge, big deal. The drying out and increased evaporation, the higher heat. If these things do have an upper temperature threshold, even though it's pretty high on some of the species. And so the higher heat is something that they have to deal with too. So climate change is this kind of umbrella over everything, more than, say, the normal things that we'd have to worry about, like the loss of wetted habitat, the loss of habitat in general, and the non-native species.
And water can withstand significant temperature changes, like if it gets warmer. But we're talking about animals living in very small volumes of water, so they experience that temperature change a lot faster than, say, would a large reservoir or a big river. You know, these fish, you think about that cotton ball marsh pupfish, think about that animal, that small, how big is the stream that it lives in?
Oh, it's probably as wide as your disc.
So it doesn't take a whole lot of time for, at 120 degree temperatures, for that water to heat up. As the desert gets hotter, you know, that water is going to get hotter. And eventually the fish, as tolerant as they are, eventually it's going to be too much.
And there's another important point I'd like to put on to the end of that, Wes. We were talking about the weirdos, the ones that were way up at the top. And, you know, because those are the most interesting to talk about, a lot of them.
Yep.
But we also have a lot of native desert fishes that are, you know, in our canyons, our streams, what have you. And I had a student who tested the temperature tolerance of these fishes, about 30 of them, I think she tested. Her name was Corey Carveth, and she and fellow grad student Ann Widber, they tested the upper thermal tolerance of these animals. And you know what the strangest thing they found was, okay, there are weirdos like the desert pupfish and the top minnows, the Gila top minnows, things like that can stand really high temperatures. A lot of our desert fishes, things like the razorback sucker, the Gila chub, the round-tailed chub, Sonora sucker, those things are right in the middle. And we were going, why don't those things take a really high temperature? You'd think they would be able to survive that, but they can't. And their temperature survival is right in line with a lot of the eastern fishes. And we thought, well, maybe in old times there were, say, more canopies over these streams, kind of cool them down a little bit more. Something was going on, you know, the streams are coming off the mountains, so they were maybe be able to stay a little bit cooler that way. But when people think desert fish, we think they're all like the extreme ones, but there are a significant number that really can't take the high temperatures. And so that's going to be a concern as the climate continues to heat on these fish. Small water, and that water's there, evaporates or it gets hotter.
And one thing that people need to remember is, unlike a butterfly or a bird, they can always migrate and shift their distributions north or south or wherever, whichever direction. Fish can't. You know,
that's true.
There's only, if you're in a stream, or especially if you're in a small spring head, you can't relocate. You can't just up and move and say, I'm going to migrate.
Yep. You're stuck.
Even in the connected rivers, I mean, a trout living in the headwaters of Arkansas cannot swim down the White River to the Mississippi River and up the Mississippi River to Minnesota. I mean, it can't do that.
Yep, exactly right. It's based on what that thing can handle physiologically, you know, where it can go. And then a lot of our desert streams seem to be disconnected too. So we'll have something that'll come out of the mountains, and the farther it goes down, then it just peters out. Because we have what we call basin and range topography out here. And so you go into the ranges, you'll have storms and mountains and, you know, some spring heads up here, and they'll come down, and you'll be following this thing. They say, follow the water down. Well, follow the water down the desert. A lot of time you'll run out of it.
Colorado River famously doesn't flow to the ocean any longer most of the time.
That's right. It had some help in drying up on that one.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this is kind of going back to one of our first cool fish. Since they put restrictions on the water withdrawal in that area, has the water level stabilized?
Yes, it has stabilized in there. I'm trying to remember if they said it's going down a little bit. They have a ring that they got to keep the level up to. And I'm trying to remember if they've said that it's going down a bit.
I asked that question because you mentioned how you're not getting any new aquifer. So it's not going to go back to its old level. I was wondering if it had just stabilized at the current level. And is that level adequate for reproduction on that shelf you talked about? Or is it still too shallow? Where I'm going with this is I was wondering, you know, would it be viable management option to go in with some kind of underwater equipment and deepen the shelf?
Well, that's a good thought. But right now, they're able to keep it at a level that's above the shelf, and it's pretty much like it was.
What else do we want to talk about?
How about the value of desert fish?
Excellent. Yeah. Why do we want to save these fish?
Yeah. Who cares, right? I'll have people who say, what are you doing down there? Why are you working on desert fish? And I'll say, well, they're not important, like a salmon or a trout or a bass. What do they do? Who cares about them? We used to have a desert fish biologist. I don't know do you know Phil Peaster? He was just a giant in the field of conservation. He was going across the desert, and there was a spring head that was drying up. He put all that fish in a bucket, and he was walking across the desert, and he goes, if I trip, I kill an entire species. So he dedicated his life to making sure these things are around. And so when somebody would come up to him and say, well, what good are desert fishes? He'd always say to them, well, what good are you? So that was his answer. But let's dive beneath that and say, it's a legitimate question. Why do we care if those things are around? And, one of the things, there's several reasons. First off, it's most obvious, they're canaries in the coal mine. If things happen to them, then we know we are messing up our environment to where it eventually gets back to people, where it hits us. And so having these things around, especially some of the more sensitive species, it can be something where you go, wow, well, I can't let that thing go because it's coming towards me pretty soon. The next thing is these things are very interesting to people. And so we've neglected to talk about tourism, right? And really, how much tourism would you have with a small fish? But, you've heard of the devil's hole pupfish. People have heard about it all across the country, and they come and see that. They come and see ash meadows. They come and see the devil's hole pupfish. And we did kind of a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And, over in that area where they're at, it's over in Nevada, California line. There are a lot of people that say, why do we worry about that stuff? Why do we have that? Well, that fish brings in tourists. And again, we did this back-of-the-envelope calculation where we figured out how much the tourists are visiting, how much they spend a day on hotels, sandwiches, whatnot, that kind of thing. We figured out that Ash Meadows in that area is bringing in $3 million a year to this relatively small, unpopulated part of the country. And so we said, well, we wonder how that ranks up with, say, Walmart or any of that kind of thing. And if you change that $3 million a year into the average salary in the area, we found that it was the 8th largest employer. Those fish were bringing people from all over and buying sandwiches, buying gas, hotel, you name it. And they're bringing $3 million. So as opposed to complaining about it, what I'd do is if I was in that area, I'd have a big festival and celebrate that we've got this really weird, interesting thing that a lot of people like to see, tourism. So you got that. You've got things like, what can these things tell us? The Pacific Yew, it was when it was up north, it was a trash tree. When they log an area, they say, oh, we got this Pacific Yew. So up in Washington, Oregon, Northern California, we cut it out. We don't want it around. Loggers want the big stuff. Well, somebody found out not too far back that Pacific Yew had this thing called Taxol in it. And Taxol was very important to fight uterine cancer. I guess my point is, just like we talked about the doctors and the kidney functions, these animals are important. What they call is biomimicry. We study them. How do they get along in these really tough conditions? Hey, wouldn't that have a lot of implications for climate change? To see how they do it. How do they handle it out? And so people have looked at these animals and, desert aquatic insects, they have strange eyes, and filmmakers, people who design technology for cameras and everything have studied their eyes and used their lens systems in designing new things. We have plants that are in the washes, and they're able to modify their structure to cool themselves. And so clothing designers, architects, they use this stuff to try to figure out how things can be cooled. And so why get rid of an ecological invention that we could copy and use to help our own lives? And so people will say, yeah, but there's some of these things that don't really have those sorts of things going for them. We can't find any reason medically. We can't find any economic value for them. What good are they? When you look at the genetic code, there are some species that if you put their genetic code in regular letters, you could stretch it from coast to coast. They're genetic masterpieces. They're just like a fine piece of artwork. And you think about, let's say, the Mona Lisa. What everyday benefit does anybody get from the Mona Lisa? You know, most people don't see it. They like knowing it's there. What use does it have? It sits on the wall, right? So there's a lot of artwork that's like that. But certainly nobody's advocating bulldozing the Louvre, turning it into a parking lot, because we don't use those things every day. And so I would argue that the final thing is they're genetic masterpieces. Don't we want to have those that we could pass down to our kids so they can enjoy them, both for the biomimicry, for the tourism, and just to know they're there?
Well, Scott, thanks for all that. That was extremely informative. I learned a lot on this episode, and I really enjoyed having you on here. Again, thanks for coming on Fish University.
I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much. Nice to see you.
And thanks, everybody, for joining Fish University. I hope to see you here again next time.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.